the total sums. I mean, I lost £862 million over that period. I caused the collapse of a 233-year-old merchant bank.
Whenever I go back and read about your story, how young you were.
The plan when I was at school was always to go to university. I came from a very working class family. You know, I was offered a job at Coutts and Company, which was the Queen's Bank. I think I was really lucky because of the timing. I went into the city in 1985. You got Big Bang. We were both a similar age and we were building a career at Morgan Stanley. Through decisions that we made shortly after that, he went on to be the managing director of Morgan Stanley and I went to jail.
What was the level of stress that led to decisions that you made?
Stress came with what I wanted to do, which was to succeed. It's not that external forces were putting the pressure on me, it was all inside. Everybody knows what doing the right thing is. Anybody who tells you that it's pressure to perform and all this sort of stuff that puts them into that situation is just lying.
Why do you fear failure so much?
Because I want success and everything is success. There's no barrier, or you perceive that there's no barrier to that success. Failure just gets less and less of an option or more and more of an ogre. It's a great question, right? And I don't think I've been asked it in 20 odd 30 years.
Okay, hi Nick. Really fantastic to have you on the Market Maker podcast. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Running around a little bit today, but yeah, looking forward to it.
Cool. Well, look, just a bit of context for you. So a lot of the people that listen to our show are in their early 20s. So sure. A lot of them might not be fully familiar with the story of yourself, the rogue trader, Barings Bank. Sure. So I'd love for this conversation to go into that journey, that story, because it's a pretty incredible one. Uh-huh. And then also a lot of the lessons learned. I'm sure in self-reflection, there's plenty. And I'd love for young people to learn from some of those challenges and things that you went through. So perhaps probably the best framing is to go back to the very beginning of your early childhood and what were you thinking at that formative years of your life about what were you going to do for a job?
I don't think I ever thought about it, to be honest with you. I think the plan when I was at school, at senior school, was always to go to university. You know, like I came from a very working class family. We lived on a council estate in Watford, and so you know, if there was a target, I suppose it was. And not that I thought in these terms, but it would have been the first person from my family, if you like, to go to university. Now that would have worked anyway because I was the oldest, but there was no real, I was a very normal kid. I did well academically from an early age. But, I was playing a lot of football, messing around and doing the things that most kids do at that sort of age, but never had a really clear idea of where I was going from a business perspective. Degree was the first thing. My youngest son is at university at the moment, and I think it's over-egged. I mean, I don't think there's any need to go to university. I think it's one of those, when you look back on your life and you look back at things that you did and you didn't do, it's just one of those stepping stones to getting a job. But once you get the job, it's all about you at that point and how good you are, how hard you work. And it's not, how much does what you learn at university really tie into that? I think it's very little. It shows that you can follow a course and you can learn independently, probably to a little degree. But I don't think it really sets you up for the world that you're going to walk into. So, I think my plan was to go and read law at university. But, that never happened. I failed one of my A levels, which probably precluded me from doing that anyway. I was offered a job at Coutts and Company, which was the Queen's Bank in England. I'd never heard of it before. A few friends from the school that I went to were applying there. So I thought that sounds quite good. I'll have a go at that. And a couple of us got interviews and, I was the only one that was offered a job. And that's what I did.
And so what was that job then? Because a lot of the young people I talk to, they've always got quite high aspirations these
Yeah.
days. But where did you start then at Coots? What
Well,
was the...
I started at the bottom. I mean, Coots probably had about 11 or 12 branches at the time. You had to be very wealthy to have a bank account there. The Coots on the Strand is where the royal family actually bank. There's a branch in there called Buckingham, um, and they look after their accounts. I don't know how they worked out who was going where. I know that's part of what your business is, as you described it to me at the beginning, and they certainly didn't have people like you in Coots back in those sort of days. So this would have been, 1985 that I started work for Coots. But somebody somewhere decided that I was going to 15 Lombard Street. So it was, if you walk out of Bank Tube Station and you walk onto Lombard Street's right in front of you. So at the time, that was the heart of the city. Parts of the city have decamped and gone to Canary Wharf over the last couple of decades, and a few of them have gone back now. But 15 Lombard Street was very much the heart of the city. It was the town. So one of the things that we used to do was town clearing. Now I don't know how old you are, Anthony, but you might not know what town clearing is either. So, if you had a check from a town clearer, so it used to have a T after the sort code, you could deliver those checks on a daily basis to the clearinghouse and you would receive payment for them. And so the clearinghouse was just below 15 Lombard Street as well, just in the little alleyway that goes through there. That was where the clearinghouse used to be. So we used to collect the town checks throughout the day, total those up, and then you'd bring them to the clearinghouse. You'd give Lloyd's their checks, you'd give NatWest their checks, and at the end of the day, after those are all processed, there'd be several £1 million that would go in either direction for those checks. So that was one of the jobs that I used to, but it was very manual. So, the checks are being presented to the cashiers give them to us in the back office part of it, if you like. Those checks are identified, looked after, and then the target at the end of the day is to take them to the clearinghouse, make sure they all get paid. You might get one or two that bounce for some reason, and then settle with the other banks as well.
So someone must have seen the way that you were operating at that point and gone, do you know what? I think he could actually probably do something else. Or was it a case like, so how did you make like a good impression there?
I think I was really lucky, right? Just, because of the timing of, so, I went into the city in 1985. You got Big Bang in 1987. So you've got this period of deregulation, lots of new banks coming into the city. And that meant there was lots of jobs. So it was really a period where the city went from being, a lot of stockbrokers and my word is my bond type of thing, to lots of big new banks and it being other people's money, it's shareholders' money. And I think there was a change in the way that everything transacted over that period. And there was a real cultural shift as well, because of the way those organisations would have done things very, very differently. So, Coots was very much a retail bank, whereas, the new banks that were coming into the city were firms like Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, all the big investment banks who were coming in, and they needed people. So, when you used to get off the tube at Lombard Street, you'd be given one of these little magazines, and there might be one article in it and the rest of it was job opportunities. And so with a very small bit of knowledge or experience, you could move around fairly quickly. And so I suppose if I look back at my career in any of the organisations that I worked in, and it was a short career, as I'm sure we'll come on to, I always wanted to be learning something new and doing something new. So I was always a quick learner. But then after I've learned something, if there's not something that's really testing me or giving me a different horizon, then I want to move on. So in the early years, Coutts and Company was a great firm to work for. We had good fun there. There was lots of, there was a good social life. And there was a lot of people that didn't necessarily come from the same working class background that I did, but, there were people that you could engage with and get along with. And, the backgrounds weren't, that massively dissimilar. And then after a couple of years, I would have been looking through one of those magazines, and there would have been a job opportunity at Morgan Stanley, and I moved to Morgan Stanley. And that's probably the way that it happened. And then you're stepping into a whole different realm of where it's trading, and there's lots of different asset classes that you can get involved in, and foreign exchange, and it's a whole different world from Coutts, which is fairly plain vanilla banking. You give out a few loans, you clear a few checks, you bounce a few checks, and there's a limited scope within that.
So how, because a lot of students as well, it's like that, almost like the fear of going into a scenario of uncertainty like that, where there's a big barrier of like terminology to learn, products to get to know, particularly with derivatives and things like that. What was your mindset at that point, going in from, as you said, from what you were doing at Coutts to then at MS?
Well, I don't think I was ever scared of anything. I think you can build yourself up into a degree of difficulty or complexity that doesn't really exist, right? If you sit back and you take your time, and you've got a decent trainer or a decent mentor around you, then you'll learn it. I mean, I don't think anything's that complex. I think the world of finance, for many decades, liked you to think that it was complex, because people really didn't, accepted what they were being told. And then you've got you've got decades of mis-selling and lots of other sort of things that have happened in the world of finance over that period, from fairly simple products to, slightly more complex products. But they've often been missold. And I think hiding behind that complexity has always been to the benefit of big banks. But when you sit down and you work your way through it, it's not that difficult. But, to answer your point a little bit further, the guys that I work with at Morgan Stanley, certainly in the futures and options area, were all very good at what they did. So, I was learning from the best, I suppose.
And culturally at that point, because so I started my career in 2005. And so there was still a few of the old life traders that were prop trading pre-financial crisis. And so they were still some of the older characters about.
Yeah.
What was MS like in those days? Was it not like it is today, where it's quite corporate, and did you fit in socially within that new framework?
Yeah. So fitting in wasn't difficult, because I suppose, going back to the way that I described the Big Bang era and all of this opportunity, I'm sure that some of these, the bigger investment banks like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs would have loved to have taken people with a double degree, or a first in everything that they possibly did. But that wasn't the environment at the time, because they needed people. And so they weren't necessarily bottom picking, but they were picking people from the middle as well as at the top, because there weren't enough. That's me just being really crude about it. And now, some of those people at the bottom and some of those people are in the middle are the absolute best people, and have gone on to tremendous success within the finance industry. So, that's definitely not a recipe for success. But, if they were looking at the time, they had to, the focus was that there was a lot of demand for people, and there wasn't a great deal of supply. So whereas the imbalance is always usually the other way, at that particular point in the world of finance, certainly in London, it was geared the other way. So there was lots of banks looking for people. So you could, just to give you an example, and these are crazy examples and they sound like crazy examples, but, I knew people who would change their jobs every 3 months, because there would be an opportunity, and the opportunity would have a little bit more money attached to it. So somebody might change their jobs 3 times in a year and increase their salary by 10 grand just because there was demand for people. And like I said at the beginning, it was people with not a great deal of experience. Um, they had to take what they could get, type of thing. Whereas it's completely the other way now, and they might be looking for a double first in maths for you to get onto a trading desk, where you might blow up just as quickly as somebody who doesn't have a degree.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always surprises me whenever I go back and read about your story
Yeah,
is how young you were. Because
yeah,
actually nowadays, someone in their like early mid 20s, so you're 25,
mm,
unless you're like an absolute rock star, it's unlikely you're going to be given that much managerial responsibility or a book of that magnitude at that
yeah,
early on.
yeah.
So yeah, that what
Again, yeah. Again, I think it's a function of the time,
yeah.
and I'm sure that many of those firms would have wanted it very differently, but you had to work with what you had available at the time. So it was a very young crowd. Just to talk about Morgan Stanley a little bit, if you like. I started off in the Commercial Union building, so near the Lloyd's building. So we were, it's around the junk. You had junk bonds at the time. So Michael Milken and, some of the girls, the guys from Drexel Burnham, and the way that they were trading at that time. And there were scandals about those over the years as well. And then Morgan Stanley moved a few of their offices to the West End, which was strange at the time as well. So the derivatives area was just off of Tottenham Court Road. I worked for a little bit in liability management, which was down in Wimpole Street, a little bit further. So it was quite fragmented. But yeah, it was a young crowd. Most of them would have come from a slightly better socio-economic background than me. But there was plenty of opportunity. I mean, I went to Japan a few times with Morgan Stanley. I would have been 20, 21 at the time. I remember going with a good friend of mine who's still a good friend now, and we were in Japan, and we were enjoying ourselves whilst we were in Japan. But at the weekends, it was quite a dull place to be. Not too many people end up in Roppongi on the weekend, so we'd sit around and we'd do silly things like we went to Disneyland together, two sort of expats going to Disneyland, where all the Japanese queue up quite formally and we're trying to jump the queue all of the time. But I use that story to explain sometimes an important part for me about the decisions that you make in your life. So, we were both a similar age, and we were building a career at Morgan Stanley. I won't say exactly what department he was in because people will work out who I'm referring to. But, through decisions that we made shortly after that, he went on to be the managing director of Morgan Stanley, and I went to jail. So two very, very similar people in similar situations, doing quite well for themselves, but based on the decisions that you make, ethical dilemmas or whatever they are, you end up in very, very different places. And that comes back to me a number of times throughout my story when you look at how other people that I was associated with at that time have gone on to do different things. Some have learnt lessons and have got involved in scandal slightly before me as well, but learnt their lesson and have gone on and prospered and done really, really well. So, unfortunately for me, one mistake, well, it's not one mistake, it's one big mistake, but, a number of mistakes that over a long period of time, unfortunately defines me for that particular period.
Well, what were you thinking at that point then? So, I mean, in a short period of time, it sounds like you're 20 years old and you're going to Japan, where you come from a working class background in Watford. So the
Yeah,
world's moved pretty quick. And
yeah,
like you said, if you've jumped roles, and I'm
yeah.
assuming the money's increasing along this period of time as well. Are you feeling like pretty confident at that point, like, oh, this is going well. And then the move, that move to Barings, then did that come about as a headhunt, or were you looking actively to go into a certain type of trading role? Or
Um, I think, like, and again, it's one of the things that was probably to my detriment as well. I never really encountered anything that I couldn't cope with. I found, doing reconciliations and stuff like that, I was a lot quicker than everybody else, and it just worked for me somehow. And if a reconciliation didn't agree and you had to try and put it all together and break it all down, that was something that I found quite easy. So that sort of, catapulted me above other people within some of the organizations that I worked for. But again, coming from some good training when I was at Morgan Stanley with people who were very good at what they did. Um, and yes, it does give you confidence. I mean, I would hate to have been in a role where I'm sat there every day and can't do it, can't crack the code, because it would be, because other people around you would be, right? So you're always trying to position where you are, or where your capabilities are within that. So I never saw a barrier to advancement, because I was always able to do what I was asked to do. Um, and that was definitely the case at Morgan Stanley. Again, after being at Morgan Stanley for a couple of years, the frustrating thing for me again was I wanted to move on. So Morgan Stanley didn't really have a life operation, so they didn't have the classic noisy, quite aggressive trading floor or trading operation on life. But they did have a guy called James Henderson who was the trader on the London traded options market. So within the stock exchange, a small part of the stock exchange there in Threadneedle Street, or probably Threadneedle Street. And so James and I used to get on quite well, and I used to do some of the settlements for him, and he wanted somebody to come down and work for him, and he asked me if I'd like to go. But then the people that I worked for wouldn't let me go. So, you're in that dilemma, and you want to get, everybody, I suppose, has aspirations of being on a desk or on a trading floor. And the more that you're within the market, that's where you want to go, or certainly was at the time. And I didn't see any barrier to that, and I was being offered that opportunity. And then the door was it wasn't shut completely, but it was only left a little bit ajar because James needed somebody then. So, yeah, I mean, Barings had been looking around for somebody who specialized in Japanese futures and options, which is what I did, but on the settlement side of it. And I went to see them. So it was a headhunt. I went to see them. They paid big bonuses. The salary was obviously an increase on what I was getting, and I wanted to move on. And they made it clear that there were plenty of opportunities if I did well. But when I got to Barings, it didn't take two years for me to get bored. It took about 9 months. And then I was immediately going to the management and saying, unless you've got something else for me to do, I'm going to move on, because I found it too easy. I wanted something that tested me. I think the one thing that I always used to love about the financial markets is no 2 days are ever the same. There's always different tests and challenges that will present to you. And that's what I wanted, and that's what I enjoyed. And I didn't want to be doing the same old role every day that you could do without thinking about it. I wanted something that was going to push me and test me and offer advancement. So I went to see Barings. So Barings Securities, the part that I worked for, was formed in 1985. So it was new. It was sort of it was formed because of Big Bang, and they were very big into the tiger economies in Southeast Asia, and also were highly specialized in the warrant and Japanese derivative markets as well. But settlements was, I'd done it, and there was nothing else that it could offer to me. So I went to see Ian Martin, and he said, look, we've got an opportunity coming up on the because they liked me, right? I was always very personable. I'd always work hard. I was never a problem until later. But I don't. Well, they didn't know I was a problem then either. That's half the problem. But yeah, no. So they were always keen for me to advance, and they knew that I was good at what I did, and that I would be able to do whatever they were challenging me with. So I went to see Ian, and Ian said, "Look, we're gonna upgrade our membership of the Sydney Futures Exchange, and we'd like you to go down there and work on the Sydney Futures Exchange." So, like, great, yeah. Now I'm going to Australia, even better than some of the trips that I've had already. But he said, in the meantime, we've got an issue out in Hong Kong. We're putting together a little bit of a task force to go out and deal with the issue in Hong Kong. I'd like you to go there. So that was it. I was on a flight to Hong Kong a few days later. I was in Hong Kong for about a month, and then they needed to move a couple of the people down to Jakarta in Indonesia. So I wasn't particularly enjoying Hong Kong at the time. So I went down to Jakarta, and I was there for about a year. And it was it was a settlement issue. They had a lot of shares that they'd bought from the market that they were trying to pass on to their clients and get paid for, but they were in bad form. So everything was quite manual. It's script trading. So if you owned an equity, it was a bearer stock, and it had to be stamped and signed. And quite often there was a signature missing, and we used to have to go around and just clean them up a bit.
So at this point, when you then start trading, are you just doing it on your own? Because I know that you started to manage a team. So at what point did then being responsible for other people as well as your own actions start to come into what you were doing?
Well, I went back from, so I finished off in Jakarta. Like, we were all in Jakarta illegally. So every now and again, you'd get a government official coming round checking work permits, and none of us ever had one. And so we used to have to fly into Singapore and renew our visas and come back in. That's quite how dodgy it was during that time, although I'm sure they would never have admitted it. But JP Morgan were at that. Everybody was at a similar sort of scenario down in Jakarta. It was quite dangerous. It wasn't a place that you walked around freely at the time. So we had a bodyguard who'd be with us. He'd pick us up from the hotel, drop us to work, and you weren't allowed to go too many other places, although that did change over time. We got a bit fed up of that, and then we started to go into places that we shouldn't have really been going to. But that's what we did, because we were all young and wanted to go and look around and see what was going on. But then when I finished in Jakarta, I went back to London. They started to build up a business development team who were looking at opportunities in different locations. So they employed a couple of business development specialists. One was based in Hong Kong, the other was in the UK. So I worked in the UK, and we looked at different, if Barings was going to open a new office. So we did that in Frankfurt, and then maybe look at opportunities where they wanted to upgrade membership of exchanges. And one of those was the Singapore International Monetary Exchange. So I went out there with a guy called Tony Dickel, who's based in Hong Kong. And we did a review of the operation and what it would cost and what they would need. And, for me, it kind of embodied, a part of the world that I really enjoyed. You were very much a big fish in a small pond when you were out in Asia. A business that I knew reasonably well in terms of being futures and options. So I put my hand up and I said I'd like that opportunity. And Tim, who was in London, and Tony, who was in Hong Kong, both supported that.
So then, that point then of getting into that period of your life then. So when you're trading from this point on, and then the real kind of the crux of your stories, sort of that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
So how did that start in terms of? I'm sure it was going well to start with. Was that
I think it was going well for less time than people imagine. I think there's a phrase that I often use when I'm speaking to audiences, and that phrase is, everybody reaches their own level of incompetence, and I kind of did that in Singapore, right? And not that it. I think you've got somebody who'd been. I moved to Singapore when I was 25, and up until that point, I'd never not succeeded at what I was doing. So I was used to success, and I was used to a lot of it, and being recognized for that success. And it brings a certain amount of status, and a desire for more success. So, I wrote a book, about stress with a psychologist who has a slightly different approach to it than me. But, I always talk about my need for success, and he talks about the status relationships, and he ends the first chapter with a phrase which is, when an immature person has status, they will do anything, absolutely anything, to protect it. So there's me thinking, I want all of this success, but I've also got all of these status relationships around me. I'm employing people. I'm building a team that are going to work on the trading floor. So they're all looking to you, as not as the oracle, but as the person that is going to shape their careers as well. And, there's a certain amount of status within that as well. You've got a board of management in Singapore who don't know a great deal about futures and options. So, it's a slightly different status dynamic. I've got people working the main desk in Japan that I'm working with, both on the sales and the trading side of it as well. So you've got all of those sort of relationships as well. And then you've got a relationship with your wife at home and your family, who think you're just this massive success story. And that's at play as well throughout this period. In the beginning, we're setting up the office in Singapore. We're employing people to work in the settlements department, putting the IT systems together and all of that sort of stuff. And I'm 25 years old, right? From a management experience or expert, like, I'm a baby, right? I'm not mature enough to take on this role. I
I'm
don't have the.
assuming then there's no given the complexity of what you're describing and the speed of making this happen, you're not getting mentored or
Oh
like
no,
trained a great deal at this point.
there's nobody in Singapore knows what a future and option is. There might be somebody who's going to help me with the settlement system, but again, I would have known that better than them. It was just, so you had Barings Securities Singapore, which would have been the equity trading arm of the business, and 98% of the people involved in Singapore were involved in that business. That's what they were good at. That's what their expertise was. And like, I'm being dropped on them and reporting to them. And there was a bit of animosity in the beginning because, my salary didn't fit in with what people were being paid. So the first battle that we had was with Simon Jones, who was the head of the operations department. And, he didn't want me getting X salary. He didn't want me getting a housing allowance of Y. He didn't want me, there were so many different things. So in the end, I actually took a pay cut to go to Singapore because it was the opportunity I craved more than anything else. It wasn't a money, it's not, if give me another 20 grand and I'll go to Singapore. That wasn't the equation. So whereas most of the people, and Simon included, would have lived near Orchard Road, which was right in the centre of Singapore, I was out in Bukit Timah because the housing allowance I was given, that's what we could afford. It's still lovely, right? But it wasn't now at the end, I'm in Orchard Road or close to Orchard Road where everybody else was. But at the beginning, it was a bit of a battle, and you could see that. So from a cultural perspective, it was always up against it. Now, I used to get on well with Simon Jones, but I get on well with everybody, right? But I might not actually like you, but I'll get on with you because for me, working at any of those banks was always, being able to get on with people was always a part of succeeding and moving on. Why do you want to fight people at work and cause issues and arguments? It's just not worth it. It's easier to get through the day and you know, I got asked at an event in South Africa many years ago. It was actually on a board meeting of a big South African bank, and they, um, I was there as a guest and a speaker, and they asked me what did I think was, the biggest skill that allowed me to get to where I got to within the world of banking. And obviously I was very accurate. I used to be very quick. I was very diligent. I used to work, every hour that was needed to get the job done. And those were all a given, I think, because, you need all of that. But I also think I was very socially adept. I could walk into a room, a very blue-blooded room of, the people that went to Eton, that went to Oxford and Cambridge, and get along. I didn't have to like them, but they would never have guessed that. They would have thought I was their best friend all of the time. But equally so, and this is the other extreme, and not too many people are going to experience this extreme. But I also survived in a gang infested, triad run gang in prison because I got along with everybody. And so being socially adept in two very, very different scenarios, and I think I definitely think it's my biggest skill. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier before we came on air, and I said my son is at university at the moment, and I don't actually know what degree he's doing, right, which is terrible, I suppose. I know it's a business degree. I know there's some economics involved in it. I don't think he really enjoys it. And I think, I hate to think that he's doing that because he thinks it's the right thing for me. And, I tell him all of the time not to do that, do something you enjoy. And if you want to change, just change. The most important thing in life, I think, is to find a job that you like and that you enjoy and that you want to go to every day, because there's thousands, well, there's probably millions of people who do a job that they don't like and they don't enjoy and they hate it every single day. And, very fortunately, I've never been in that situation. But I would encourage everybody to find something that they want to do and that they enjoy. And, don't be pulled down by, what society expects or what your parents expect. I mean, I don't think parents should expect anything of their children other than for them to be happy and to enjoy what they're doing. And, I think we can all look at our kids and think, would my son survive on the trading floor? I don't think so. He's too nice. Right. And so was I. I wasn't ruthless enough. Right. You hear stories about people treading on people's heads and, or at least on their toes to get where they want to get to. I wasn't that person. Stereotypically, it gets associated with me every now and again, but nobody who knows me will tell you that. And that includes everybody who worked in the world of banking at the time as well. So you've got to find your niche, find your lane. And, I think, when I tell my son, I think, a marketing or a sales role is like, he's great with people, right? Great with people. And it always has been since he was 4 years old. He's always, and that's where I think his lane is and the one that he should maybe explore a little bit more. But I think he still thinks he wants to work in a bank, and whatever I tell him is not going to put him off that.
It's like having a dad who's a famous football player, though. He feels
Yeah,
like he's maybe in the shadow. But look, with one thing I found really interesting there was like yours. I wonder if we could just explore a little bit quickly your social skills then, because I have to deal with the students a lot, and our
yeah,
company is all very kind of data driven to identify performance. But then
yeah,
actually, as you rightly said, even to this very day, in all roles, it's that ability to get on with people that's
yeah.
critically important as well. So when you think about it, was it that was hard coded into your DNA as a kid and your upbringing, or did you learn some of those skills to be able to get on, like you said, to go up the social spectrum with people that you didn't
Yeah.
grow up with? So where did that come from?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And I don't think I've been asked it in 20 odd 30 years of doing after dinner speaking and conferences. Um, like I always wanted more, and I wouldn't have like I'm not extrovert by any stretch of the imagination, and coming back from Singapore all those years ago and standing up in front of crowds and talking about my experiences would have absolutely scared me to death. Um, but I think I was always, I'm not opinionated, right? I don't, you could, I wouldn't have an opinion on anybody, right? I think I treat everybody at face value and always have. And I think that's so I don't come into any situation with a preconceived idea of what's going to be. I think I'm a really good judge of character. I think I always have been. Um, and yeah, I don't know where that comes from, to be honest with you. Is it a working class background and that desire to achieve and have a little bit more, and therefore you have to be accepting of everybody in order to achieve that little bit more? I don't know. Look, I think it's a great question, and I don't have the answer for you because I've never really thought about it in that regard. But I think you get, like, if you get, and like, I hate using cliches, right? So but if you give respect, you will receive respect. And I think, certainly within the world of finance, if you're good at what you're doing and you're hard working, I think you are given that respect a little bit quicker, maybe, than some other industries where it's not so obvious of the disparity. But yeah, no, look, I think that's a great question, to be honest with you. And I don't know. I can't give you the answer. I certainly can't give you an academic answer to it anyway.
Well, look, there was some things you highlighted there, like stress, for example. So, kind of stress and resilience, because I think these are two huge topics that young people, particularly going to any high pressure job, finance or
Yeah.
not finance, they're going to confront. And so, maybe given that a lot of them are not familiar with your full story, so what was
Yeah.
the level of stress then? Like, what was the scenario in Singapore that led to the
Yeah.
kind of decisions that you made, and what were you feeling at that point?
Look, the stress was off the chart. I mean, people talk about PTSD after they've been to war. I'm sure I had PTSD. It was, yeah, look, but it was, I suppose the easiest way to describe it or to maybe frame it is, stress came with what I wanted to do, which was to succeed. So it's not that external forces were putting the pressure on me. It was all in. It was all inside. So I'm actively, seeking jobs that are going to test me a little bit more, and that's going to impose stress. I mean, during the period that I was in Singapore, just to give the viewers an idea, like or the total sums. I mean, I lost £862 million over that period. I caused the collapse of a 233-year-old merchant bank. Like, the position is just getting worse all of the time. My own position is bigger than the rest of the market. It's impossible to unwind. But you've still got everybody buying into the success story. So it becomes very Jekyll and Hyde, depending on who you're in front of. So, if you've got, one of the board members arriving from London and they're coming into Singapore and they want to look at the trading floor, it's all about the success. You get back to the office and you're looking at the statements to see how the position is blown up and how much money you've lost that day. And it's all, it's all about the stress and the worry and how the hell am I going to get out of this? So it was a complete contradiction throughout that period, but it was basically, and the contradiction really, I suppose, existed based on what environment you're in. So, board member coming from London on the trading floor, yeah, you're blasé and everything's great and you're knocking out volume here, there, and everywhere. And again, the trading floor was all buying into the success story as well, because every time they saw me trade in Singapore, I would trade in size and I would squeeze them out and they would lose money. So every time they saw me trade, they thought I was winning, whereas behind me, I've got another position in Osaka, which is going down the pan. So when you look back on it, it's how I kept it going, I don't know. Um, alcohol was definitely one way for a period of time, and it's a coping mechanism that your viewers are all quite young. It doesn't work, so don't bother getting involved in it. So there are better coping mechanisms, and I always implore people to ask for help and advice. I was surrounded by people that could have helped me, could have steered me in a different direction, and the story would have been very different. The outcome would have been very different. I think you need to act early if you find yourself in a difficult position. It doesn't matter what that is, if it's your health, if it's your own finances, or something that's going on at work. The earlier you act, the better the outcome. If you get into a situation where you hide a problem and it festers and it gets worse, by the time you come to remedy it, sometimes it's insurmountable. It's gone so far in the opposite direction that you're not able to solve it. And that was definitely the case in my situation. But I think just, like when I was in Singapore, I was 25 when I went there. Very different environment to modern day, 2026 banking, or 2026 anyway. It was 1990s banking. It was all about making money. Ego and greed is good sort of type of philosophy. And at the age of 25, I saw asking for help as a sign of weakness. If I turned around to somebody on the trading floor and I said, could you help me with this? They'd laugh at me. Right. That would be the first response. And then they might ridicule me, I don't know, go and get me a cup of pity or something. I don't know, or whatever it was. It's, it was a very, very different environment. But I'd encourage everybody now to look at asking for help and advice as a sign of wanting to do things correctly. I did an interview with somebody the other day, and they were asking me about who my mentors were and stuff like I didn't have one at that time, and there was nobody really I looked up to, because I was confident in my own ability, I suppose. Was I overconfident in it? Maybe at times. But, I had ability. Unfortunately, most people don't remember that these days. They think about the loss and whatever else. And, I have to tell people that I didn't lick it off the ground to get there. It was, I was good at what I did for a period of time. I'm the first to admit that I messed up on a grand scale, but it's not the way that I'd planned it.
Yeah, it sounds like having a mentor then is really important because it gives you like an environment where you can feel comfortable. Because I guess a lot of the young people I deal with who are going into these types of banks now, they're still scared. Like it sounds like almost like you were to a certain degree in a way of what are people going to think? They're going to get rid of me, and so there's always this temptation to hide things that you're not doing right or something's gone wrong. And I know when I worked on a trading floor, the thing I always had wanted the most from any of my juniors day one was like, if you make a mistake, you must tell me straight away. And
Sure.
then that's always the red
Yeah.
line of like honesty that makes everyone work better.
Yeah,
Um,
and look, the constant thing is that you've always got to do the right thing, right? And I think if you if you look at the consequences of not doing the right thing, and they're made obvious to you, you won't do it. Like even for me, and I was talking, I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, but it was about. Oh yeah, no, it was some. I did a thing earlier this week with some students in Mexico about my story, and we're talking about surveillance and how surveillance has changed over the years, and that's a great career for somebody. Surveillance, right? It's always changing, and I think you don't need to be on the trading floor. There's lots of ancillary roles that are just as that interesting and give you that capacity to be able to do something new every day. But if I go back to my time back in Singapore, and being on the trading floor sorry, I was there in 1992. I said 1995 earlier, but being there in 1992, if there'd been somebody strong and good around me, looking at the controls and the systems and monitoring what I was doing, I wouldn't have done it because I wouldn't want to be embarrassed by them highlighting that I was doing something incorrectly. So I think, everybody knows what doing the right thing is. Anybody who tells you that it's pressure to perform and all this sort of stuff that puts them into that situation is just lying. Jerome Kirby will still use that story today about 20 years after he lost all of the money at Societe Generale. Like, what you're doing, as I did. I knew I shouldn't be doing it. And I'm embarrassed to say that I continued. And, for those reasons, I'm fully accountable and responsible for my actions during that time. But it's still embarrassing. And, nobody should. No, I don't think anybody wants to put themselves deliberately in an embarrassing situation. But, you also need a management or you need senior managers within the organisation that you work for that are approachable, that will talk to you on equal terms and will encourage you to show you their mistakes. And a very good friend of mine is a CIO of a big European bank these days, and he uses my story to say to people, you're going to make mistakes, right? Everybody makes mistakes, but what you can't do is you can't hide them. Come and tell me about them, and I'll help you through them as much as I can. But the one thing that you can't do is hide mistakes. So that transparency, that honesty, I think will always put people in good stead. And it will also make sure that you maintain your own moral and ethical fibre as well. That you're not, putting any of those at risk, because then do you do it again type of thing.
Yeah, I do think it's definitely, as you say, it's a two-way street, and because I often feel like you're painted out to be like the villain here, and there's a responsibility as well of. I know times back then were a lot different to what they're like today in like regs and compliance and all the rest of it, but I feel like you said, it's a two-way street. Management has got to want to actively encourage an environment where that can happen, that conversation.
Yeah,
In
but
such a way.
I agree with you. When we're looking at modern day bank,
Yeah,
I was never going to put my hand up and ask for help because fear of failure was too big for me. Right, there was nothing that there was nothing worse than failing
So
because
why did you
because I
fear
was used to
failure?
success.
Why do you fear failure so much?
Because I want success, and everything is success motivated, and that was probably instilled in me in a young age because I'm coming from a working class background. My mother was quite academic, but she always wanted us to push ourselves at school, and I did. And you'd get the plaudits for that. I was always a year and a half ahead of everybody else when I was in junior school, kind of pulled back more into the mainstream during senior school. But I went to a very good senior school that used to be a grammar school. Yeah, success was the thing. I always wanted to be successful. So I think if you build that up over the years and then you start in the world of business, and again, you're still enjoying that success, and you're not, there's no barrier, or you perceive that there's no barrier to that success, failure just gets less and less of an option, or more and more of an ogre when you think of it. Yeah, like success is still important to me today. So I get a lot of success out of how the kids are doing, and how they're getting on within their roles. It's not so much about but at the time it was very, very personal, and I had a very elevated opinion of what success meant. For me, it was getting to the top of the organisation and making all the big decisions. But again, going back to that book that I wrote. The psychologist kind of explained that some people get success from putting food on the table for their kids to eat. So two very, very different views of how you succeed within that particular area.
Maybe the final part then is kind of, it's very much connected, I guess, to what you just spoke about, which is resilience, because a lot of the kind of interactions I have with companies now, and they give me feedback about their interns or their grads and stuff like that. And a lot of them have come through a pathway in their life, these young people, where they've just continually had success academically.
Mm.
And they've gone to quite a structured environment, maybe a good school. Every support has been given to them. So they've just smashed it out the park as far as the world would see it,
Yeah.
i.e., education. And then you get on the trading floor, and as you know, the market slaps you around the face a few times on day one, and you realize that I haven't got it worked, I can't work it all out, I'm not right all the time, just
Yeah.
the nature of it. And they're not able to cope with that particularly well. And so, having you had the experience that you had going to prison, having cancer, things like that, like how now in retrospect, what would be practical good advice to get people to build up those muscles of being a resilient individual in preparation for some of the careers that's ahead of them, do you think?
Um, yeah. Again, it's a good question, and I believe, um, I think sometimes you have to reframe the way that you think about things, and I had to do a lot of that when I was in prison, in order to survive some of the time. So you have to constantly adapt. But I do believe that we all have an innate strength, and I don't think that any of us really encounter anything that we can't cope with. But you have to be able to find it. When I arrived in Singapore, you're sleeping on the floor, it's rough and uneven. There's two triad gang members in the cell with you. You come from a very white collar crime. There's the cell 6 foot by 9 foot. It's 100 degrees early in the morning. It's 130 degrees in the evening when the heat starts to rise, and it is just the most impossible environment. And whilst I always felt reasonably safe with within that environment, the conditions are really, really tough. You, but somehow you get through it, and you have to think differently about how you pass time, and you build up a degree of resilience over that sort of period. I think it's very difficult to teach resilience, right? It's about doing all of the other things that we've already partially spoken about. If you're transparent, if you're honest, if you're trying to do the right thing all of the time, then I think some of that resilience will come to you. If you're doing the wrong thing and you're hiding things, you're always going to be at a panicked level. I think the more transparent you can be about things, and I think communication is just such a powerful tool. Um, as I said at the beginning, I wouldn't necessarily have described myself as a great communicator. Barings as an organisation was an exceptionally poor communicator. Everybody was trapped in these silos trying to do their own bit of work. But for me, and that was probably prison was probably the most difficult part. And when I arrived back in Singapore, I had the best part of 4 years to go, and it looked like that was the end of the world, right? Because I'm incarcerated already, so I've got no choice other than to do it. But one day is just, it is so long because you've got nothing, right? You get one book a month. You're locked up for 23 hours a day. You're locked up for. Those are the conditions. It's that sort of heat, and you just, it's never ending. And you kind of look for the sharpest corner in the room, and you think, it might be better to bang my head off of that and just knock myself out for a week or a month or whatever, and go to the sick bay. So the thing that worked for me was communication, and it wasn't communicating with other prisoners. Somebody says, did I make any friends? I didn't go there to make friends, right? Nobody goes to prison. Well, some people do. I'm sure career criminals go to prison to make friends with other career criminals, and maybe they plan what they're going to do afterwards. That wasn't the remit for me. So I started a diary. So I used to write to myself every day in this diary. So those little sort of A5 sort of exercise books. you could buy one of those a month, and there were 30 odd pages in it. So you could write to yourself. So I'd always be thinking about things that had happened, how, um, the way that I reacted, the way that I would have preferred that I reacted. And you have to be really, you really have to be self-critical, and you really have to pull back the veneer and be quite nasty to yourself, but you're only writing to yourself. And then look at the way that you would have preferred to react. And it went across everything, both business, home, family, every sort of relationship that you're looking at. It depends what occurred to you that day. But for me, getting it down on paper was a good way of unloading it and trying to deal with it. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was there for the best part of 4 years. So there was a lot of unloading and trying to work out how I would have preferred to react during that sort of period. I think what prison, cancer and everything else that I've experienced teaches me is that I'm not really scared of anything anymore. Um, and it's about, again, not with cliches. You want to live life as best as you can, but I'm very centered around the people that are important for me. I think when you're in a business career and you're doing well, it is quite transient. People that you work with will come and go and they'll change, but your friends hopefully stay there forever. And that's the most important part of it. So as much as, I used to be quite good at going into work in the city and getting along, but it was always important that in the evening, or certainly at the weekends, I'd be back home, and kept myself quite grounded in that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that last point. I think your mates that you grow up with are the ones that I've always felt like know you truly and have got your
Yeah,
back no matter what. And so whatever your problem, they're always people you can confide in.
sure.
So for sure. So look, Nick, thank you so much for sharing those insights. I'm sure everyone listening got a great deal out of that. I'm so pleased of your kind of honesty, and also people to understand all of those amazing qualities that you had that got you into that position. And then what happened, but then all the other things as well that you've done since, and all the learnings to share from it. So thank you so much, Nick, for giving us your time.
No worries. Thank you.